So let me try and clear the air from that, because this is not about everyone asking for proof. Show me Christianity is true. Ha, you fool. No sign for you, no evidence for you. That's not like a good pat response to people who are asking for evidence. That's not the right thing to do. Some people use this phrase from Jesus, no sign for you, to say that looking for signs is bad in and of itself. Like it's inherently bad to ask for evidence. But that's a little confusing, because then we have stories in the Bible where, like, Mary, she's like, how will I know? Right? And then, she's given a sign, Zechariah, when he's like, how will I know? And they're like, you unbeliever. And he's struck dumb, right? He can't speak. So we have people asking the same questions, but with different hearts. And they're getting very different answers.
In this section, Mike is directly saying that he's not talking about people that are immediately convinced or eventually convinced by the explanations that are given to him. And he reinforces that questions are a good thing, or that evidence is a good thing. But this is a very contradictory thing for him to say at this point in his sermon, because he wants you to question his religion, but he doesn't want you to critically question his religion. And if you're too critical of his religion, he just labels you as not wanting it to be true, or that you have some kind of malicious intent behind the questions that you're asking. As I said before, I don't control what convinces me. If your answer doesn't convince me, that's not a conscious decision on my part to remain unconvinced. There is no heart issue here at all.
I think that evidence helps people. Lots of people have come to Christ through evidence, but lots of other people can see all that evidence and it doesn't make a lick of difference, because it's not just evidence that's the issue here. And that's what we're going to get at tonight. Evidence is not enough.
Evidence can be good enough. It's just that your evidence is not good enough. It can't survive actual critical thought. He needs the listen and believe type of person in order for his evidence to be convincing. Don't be a listen and believe person. Carefully consider the answers that you're given. He continues to talk about how Jesus loved giving evidence to everybody in the Bible. He healed the sick, deaf, and blind. He cast out demons. And he even raised the dead. All of this is to show who Jesus is in the fictional story. These aren't things that we have actual evidence for other than the Gospels, which are not reliable at all. He also mentions this.
In Mark chapter 3, Jesus heals a man with a withered hand right in front of the Pharisees. So he's giving them signs. He's giving them signs, right? We've read about how he says, so that you will know the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sin, get up and walk.
This is a reversal from 1 Kings 13:4. And when the king heard the saying of the man of God, which he cried against the altar at Bethel, Jeroboam stretched out his hand from the altar, saying, seize him! And his hand, which he stretched out against him, dried up, so that he could not draw it back to himself. This is a clear sign that this miracle, just like all the other miracles Jesus does, had a theological purpose behind it. And it is in fact not a matter of history. Now, Mike would say that I don't want this passage to be real. In reality, I just want actual evidence for the truth of your religion. The fact that this miracle was made up to specifically advance a theological message makes me wonder what else in your Gospels are made up to advance similar theological messages.
There's another public miracle that Jesus did very recently in the Gospel of Mark, and that is he fed the multitudes. He fed the multitudes. He actually did it twice, right? And when he feeds the multitudes, obviously there's tons of witnesses of this great miracle that would tie directly into Jesus as the new Moses, So then this is like fulfilling the Pharisees' request before they ask of it.
This is funny because these miracles were actually two versions of the same miracle originally. First of all, the spontaneous increase of food is a known miracle from the Old Testament. Elisha and Elijah both performed this same type of miracle. In Mark's version of the Old Testament miracles, Jesus feeds 5,000 people with a few loaves of bread and fish. A couple of chapters later, he's tasked with feeding 4,000 people. This is when the disciples say, how can one feed these people with bread here in this desolate place? It's like,
dumb bitch.
But you see, it doesn't stop there. The disciples do this twice in the same section. But after the second time, Jesus justifiably replies with,
dumb bitch.
The point is that these miracles are just copy and pasted from the Old Testament into the New Testament with some details and names changed. This is theology. This is not history. While Mike is currently talking about the Pharisees in this section, he definitely believes these miracles of Jesus to be evidence of his divine godhood. Continuing in Mike's sermon, Jesus basically says, "Believe me, I'm very God," to the Pharisees.
But on our human side, how do we know, right? Like, anyone can say that. So how do we know that Jesus is who he says he is? So he's doing these works. And so he even meets us there and says, if you don't believe me just on his own authority, believe because of the works. So he points to the works as evidence.
Well, the problem is that those works didn't actually happen and that they're only there to push a theological message. Anyone could and did say that they were God. It takes extraordinary evidence to prove extraordinary claims.
So John, it seems to me, has more reason to believe than most humans have. And he doubts, but it's sincere. And Jesus meets him right there, gives him evidence, gives him reasons, all that stuff. So sincere doubt, evidence, let's give people help. They're confused, they're struggling, they're looking for help. Let's point to publicly accessible miracles as evidence of who Christ was, of, say, his death and resurrection, of fulfilled prophecy in the scriptures. Let's give people something to hold on to for those times where they're struggling, right? That's a good thing. I think that's a Jesus thing. I think Jesus did apologetics right there in Luke chapter 7.
Mike thinks that fictional claims from his theological book should be enough to convince anybody of Jesus' God status. And if you're not immediately, or at least eventually convinced by this evidence, which actually isn't evidence, then you just don't want it to be true or don't want to believe. It's a heart issue for him. I think the real issue here is that Mike is convinced by magical things a little too easily.